One of the most touching scenes in Avatar The Last Airbender is the final reunion scene between Zuko and Iroh. Zuko is so concerned that Iroh will reject him. Zuko is so anxious about everything he has done wrong, about his regrets and his laments. He knows the gravity of what he has done to his uncle specifically and to the people of other nations more generally through his ardent, dogmatic devotion to the Fire Nation. He knows that he does not necessarily deserve complete acceptance. And it's worth noting that when he's talking to Team Avatar, that's not what he demands. He doesn't demand much of anything at first. He simply presents himself to them in a position of complete abjection, a position of complete dependency and begging for forgiveness. He hopes that someday, sometime, he'll be able to get into their graces again, and that they will at least give him a chance. And they treat him in the way that decent, typical people who have been wronged by someone would in this situation. They're skeptical. They're not completely unsympathetic, but they are not going to accept Zuko unconditionally. Aang gradually accepts Zuko after Zuko helps him master firebending and demonstrates a true sympathy and a true understanding regarding everything that Aang has endured. This episode builds off the tentative, tenuous connection developed between Aang and Zuko all the way back in Season 1, when Zuko is in the role of the Blue Spirit. Sokka is able to forgive him somewhat easily after Zuko helps him, though their relationship is rather simplistic compared to Zuko's relationship with Aang or his relationship with Katara, the latter of which is far more fraught because she did express understanding for him. She did prove herself willing to treat him with tenderness and thoughtfulness. She opened herself up and cared about him in spite of everything he had done to her and to Team Avatar. And yet, none of that unrelenting, freely given care and concern stops him from betraying her, so she's still hurt. The Zuko interaction with Iroh is something very different. Iroh listens to Zuko. He hears enough to truly understand how sorry Zuko is, and how ashamed he is of how he was acting before, and how he has responded to that shame by trying to do what he believes is right, trying to atone for his past actions. But Iroh does not set conditions. He does not force Zuko to prove himself. Instead, he simply accepts Zuko purely, directly, and unconditionally, which surprises and overwhelms Zuko. This moment is touching because the acceptance is so devout and so sincere. But if it was only sweet, the moment would not be as powerful and as poignant as it is. The moment works so well in the context of Avatar because it not only demonstrates Zuko returning to Iroh and being willing to offer himself in this position of complete humility to Iroh, but also because it justifies Iroh's ideas about forgiveness, about redemption, about correcting one's behavior that are present throughout the show. Iroh's love for Zuko is deep and pure, as deep and pure as any expression of love in the show, but it is not simplistic. Iroh understands that love does not make two people into one. That might sound obvious, but especially in regards to romantic love, we tend to overlook that fact. We speak of an us in a couple. We speak of a singular identity between two people in a close relationship, especially if that relationship is romantic. But honestly, even in the context of a family, there is this idea that a family can have one voice, one perspective. And that's not altogether true. It's a nice fantasy, but that's all it is, a fantasy. One person cannot control the behavior of another. Not in a true and organic and mutual way. One can control others directly, harshly, in an authoritarian manner, but that is not love. That's not affection. That's not true appreciation. Love, the kind that's nurturing but not binding, says Avatar, is the kind that wishes the best for others, but ultimately understands that the others are free to make their own decisions. A moral view or dogmatic perspective cannot be forced on them. Iroh obviously believes what Zuko is doing is not right. That is not particularly controversial. And yet Zuko, whether he understands it or not, still receives Iroh's full support. Iroh knows that Zuko has to make a decision for himself if he is to understand the hollowness of the Fire Nation's promises and the vacuousness of that militaristic, expansionist ideological framework. Zuko needs to understand that for himself, and not because he was forced or pushed into thinking that way. He needs to discover that truth empirically through his own judgments and his own choices. Zuko understands this to some extent, and that is why he is emphatic when he's speaking to Ozai about how he realized what was right and what was true, not through dictates, not through dogma, not through directives, but through his own personal moral worldview. He developed that worldview based on his experiences. Those experiences gave him the power to evolve in his perspective, to evolve in his thinking. And so Zuko is ultimately right when he declares that he changed and did what was right and that he did it on his own. Some have said, well, what about Iroh? And of course Iroh helped him a lot. So did a lot of people, though not quite as overtly as Iroh. Every circumstance Zuko went through, especially in Season 2, pushed him steadily toward the transformation and perspective that Zuko undergoes. But ultimately, the decision that Zuko makes has to be his own. Iroh says this exact thing to him when Zuko reunites with him. He says that Zuko found his way back on his own. He does not mean that Zuko didn't have any help. Of course, Zuko had a lot of help. But he means that Zuko ultimately had to make the decision to return to Iroh for himself. He had to make the decision to return to what is just and moral by himself after erring at the end of Season 2. That final triumph is much greater for Zuko because it was so difficult and so hard to earn. The easy point for Zuko to make that decisive leap from obfuscation, from misunderstanding, from a skewed perspective to a clearer and more moral view would have been at the end of Season 2, when he has had all of this overt help pushing him in the direction of making that change. And yet, when he actually makes that change, it's in Season 3, when he is given everything he wants, and the circumstances he is in encourage him to stick with the status quo, and yet he, by virtue of his own values and his own experiences, ultimately sees that such luxury and such indulgence that he is allowed to enjoy as a lead member of the Fire Nation is ultimately insufficient. Iroh understands this so well, not because he is innately wiser than everyone else. He was not born a brilliant philosophical genius with a gift for tea and advice. He explicitly says, albeit in a half-jokingly manner, to Aang that the key to both tea and wisdom is proper aging. Of course, aging itself does not bring wisdom, but aging is, to a certain extent, necessary, in that it involves going through experiences that challenge one's preconceived perspectives and values and force one to think about those values and those beliefs in a new light. One, through experience, comes to attain a greater and broader sense of understanding than merely the superficial values of a specific cultural climate. For Zuko, the hyper-militaristic, hyper-brutal, and uncaring and callous climate of the Fire Nation royal court. Iroh grew up in a similar climate. He fully bought into the militaristic ideology of the Fire Nation, as episode 207 Zuko alone demonstrates. Iroh brags about wanting to burn Ba Sing Se to the ground. He ultimately abandons that ideology because he finds it futile and hollow, because he lost his son, and because Ozai usurping the throne turned out to be a good thing for Iroh, because it forced him to reconsider what he really believed. It forced him to really look on his loss of his son and what that means for him. No one could tell him that, oh, that Fire Nation national ideology is rotten. He had to arrive at that decision for himself. And he knows Zuko has to do the same. And Zuko, after realizing this, understands that Katara has to do the same. And that is why he behaves the way that he does toward Katara in the Southern Raiders. I am a little disappointed that not a lot of people seem to pick up on this, because it seems to me quite obvious. Zuko does not want Katara to kill this man. He doesn't have a visceral desire that she should spare his life, unlike Aang, but Zuko has by this point grown quite skeptical of the tendency toward violence and revenge. He could have killed Ozai in Ozai's throne room by redirecting lightning back at him, but he chose not to. He chose not to take revenge. It would be fallacious to assume that he thus wants Katara to take revenge. What he wants is for Katara to confront this situation. He wants her to look at it for herself and examine it herself and ultimately come to her own decisions about what she wants for herself, about who she really is morally and philosophically. What is she comfortable doing? Only then he knows will Katara truly have peace, and he helps her find it. Aristotle talks eloquently about how love, the best kinds of love, are those that support the good in the other. It doesn't mean that you're capricious in how you love someone. It doesn't mean that you just instantly abandon them when they do something you think is wrong. It does imply sort of loyalty. Aristotle wouldn't say otherwise, but ultimately, these bonds of love and connection are the best and the highest when they are formed for the commitment to the good, to helping someone be better, not in a dogmatic way, not in a way where you're teaching someone a lesson like some solemn, stern schoolmaster, but in the way that you are encouraging someone to explore their highest and most virtuous and most vibrant qualities. This conception and foundation of love as a devotion to the selfless and the noble and the fulfilling of the self in a deep and spiritual and philosophical way is the exact opposite of the authoritarian, forced, dogmatic kind of loyalty demanded by the Fire Nation. And it is this committed but not dogmatic or binding kind of love and appreciation that Avatar, the show, deeply venerates in this final scene of acceptance and reunion between Zuko and Iroh. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Keep watching Avatar. It's a great show, and it gets better with every rewatch. See y'all soon. Tune in soon. Adios, comrades.